This is a terrifying case that should have been totally avoidable. On February 25, 2006, a young woman named Angelika Kluk disappeared from Glasgow, Scotland, where she was working a summer job at a church. The day she vanished, she had been helping the church's handyman, Pat McLaughlin. Police interviewed those who had seen her last, and hours later, McLaughlin had fled the city. Investigators soon found out that his name was in fact Peter Tobin, and that he was a sex offender who had assaulted two 14-year-old girls in 1994. As the search for Angelika continued, a secret chamber was found beneath the floor of the church, with Angelika's body inside. She had been bound, beaten, and assaulted, then stabbed at least 16 times. Investigators would soon link Tobin to two other homicides, that of 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton and 18-year-old Dinah McNicol in 1991. Both were found buried at one of his former residences. He was convicted of the crimes and sentenced to life in prison, but considering his prior arrests, one has to ask why he was not still behind bars. The evil man who would go on to take at least 3 lives was born on August 27, 1946 in Johnstone, Scotland, as the last of 8 children to Daniel and Marjorie Tobin, just a year after the end of World War II. Peter would get into trouble at a young age and was sent to an approved school in 1953 at only 7 years old. An approved school is essentially a reform school for delinquent children, though it did not seem to be effective as he was later sent to a youth detention facility. Some believe that Peter Tobin was behind the Bible John crimes in Glasgow, which occurred from 1968 to 1969 when he would have been in his early 20s. But the timelines do not match up unless he was traveling a fair distance to commit these homicides, though this would explain why the culprit was not caught during the police searches in the city. He got married to a 17-year-old girl named Margaret Mountney in 1969 when he was 23 and living in Brighton, England. Because of this, police ruled him out as a Bible John suspect, since he was not anywhere near the area for the final 2 homicides, though he did look quite similar to the composites made of the unknown monster. It seems like it would be fairly easy to get a confirmation or rejection of him as a suspect by asking the witnesses who saw Bible John whether he was the man they had seen. In 1970, he would be arrested for burglary and forgery, which may have been one of the final straws for his wife as they separated in that year, then divorced in 1971. 2 years later, in 1973, Tobin married a 30-year-old nurse named Sylvia Jeffries, and the two had a son named Ian that same year. In 1975, they had a daughter named Claire, but sadly this second child would pass away soon after being born, and the couple divorced in 1976. His ex-wives described Tobin as a well-dressed psychopath who was initially charming, but who would turn violent once a relationship was established. And this seems to be the case as he would get married a 3rd time in 1989, this time to a woman named Kathy Wilson. The couple had had a son named Daniel 2 years before the wedding. In 1990, they moved to Bathgate, Scotland before getting a divorce. Unlike his previous wives, Kathy did not take her son when she left Peter. And the creature would use young Daniel as a tool to put 2 young girls at ease in 1993 before attacking them. This was after he had already taken the lives of 2 young women while Daniel was in his custody. The first of Tobin's known homicides occurred on February 10, 1991. 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton had been waiting for a bus in Bathgate. She was never seen again, but her purse was found on February 21st in Edinburgh. At the time, Tobin was living just a mile from the bus stop she disappeared from, but it would be more than 15 years before her family would discover what had happened to her. Just months after Vicky Hamilton disappeared, Tobin was once again on the prowl for another victim. 18-year-old Dinah McNicol was last seen hitchhiking with a friend from a music festival in Liphook, England. They accepted a ride from a man with a Scottish accent who dropped her friend off, then drove off with Dinah, who would never be seen alive again. After her disappearance, someone would use her bank card to withdraw well over £2,000 from her account. 6 weeks later, Peter moved into a house at 50 Irvine Drive in Margate. His neighbors described him as a normal guy who had his son Daniel on the weekends. But there were signs of the horror that hid behind the mask of normality. A neighbor named David Martin once saw him digging a huge hole in his yard. He jokingly asked if Tobin was digging to Australia, to which the creature replied that he was making a sandpit for his son. The truth was that he was digging a grave for his 2 victims, and shortly after this exchange the hole was filled in. One has to wonder where he was keeping the young women's bodies up until this point, and how he was able to escape detection. Though his first homicides would not be discovered for many years, and not until after he had committed a 3rd, he would find himself in legal trouble for 2 attempted homicides. While living in Lee Park, England on August 4, 1993, Peter met two 14-year-old girls who had come to visit a neighbor who was not home. He lured them into his apartment to wait, and they entered willingly. After all, how could a man with his young son mean them any harm? He then held them at knife point and forced them to drink alcohol. Once they were intoxicated, he assaulted them. And I think at this point it's clear what I mean in my videos when I say assault. But he would also do what the British refer to as buggery, which is a funny term for an evil act that is not at all funny or acceptable. Once he was done, he left the two unconscious teenagers in the apartment with the unlit gas stove on in an attempt to suffocate them. Thankfully, they both survived the ordeal and Tobin was forced to flee. As he would do later, he found refuge among a religious community, settling in Coventry and joining the Jesus Fellowship using a fake name. He would not be able to escape the law, however, and he was arrested in 1994 when his car was identified in Brighton. On May 18th of 1994, he pled guilty for the disgusting crimes that he had committed against the 14-year-olds, and he was sentenced to 14 years in prison, which does not seem long enough. However, Tobin would not even serve the full sentence as he was released in 2004 after only 10 years. How is it that the worst people always seem to be released early, and somehow their prior crimes are not exposed and counted against them? After his release, Tobin disappeared without the approval of his parole officer from the town of Paisley where he had been living, and began going by the name Pat McLaughlin after attacking a neighbor, and an arrest warrant was issued. While on the run, he found work at St. Patrick's Church in Glasgow. This church had other problems as it turned out that the priest, Father Jerry Nugent, was abusing young women, including a 23-year-old Polish student working a summer job at the church named Angelika Kluk. But Angelika would not only have the priest to contend with. She was on friendly terms with the handyman who she knew as Pat McLaugin, and on the day she disappeared, Angelika had been helping him paint a shed. This, of course, led police to interview him, which caused Tobin to flee before they completed the search of St. Patrick's. Investigators soon came across a place where it appeared as if the floorboards had been tampered with. When they pulled up the carpet, they found a hatch that was 28 inches by 18. Beneath this was Angelika's body. She was bound and gagged, and she had been badly beaten with a wooden object and stabbed at least 16 times. Upon seeing the extreme level of violence, investigators did not believe that this was the handyman's first time, and the search was on. Meanwhile, a woman in the community had come forward to police with Tobin's real name. While all this was going on, the creature had slipped away to London, where he adopted yet another name. Luckily, a nurse recognized him from the news reports at a hospital and called the police. Constable Alan Murray approached the man who had been reported, and Tobin readily admitted to his identity. He was initially brought in for violating the terms of his release so that police would have time to build their case against him. His shirt and watch both had DNA evidence linking him to the Kluk homicide. They would also begin Operation Anagram, which was an investigation into Tobin's past to see what other skeletons he had in his closet. This was when they established that his former residences corresponded to several disappearances. On June 4, 2007, police searched the home that he had been living in when Vicky Hamilton went missing and found a hidden dagger that was determined to have residue that was a close match to Vicky's DNA despite the years that had passed since the crime. They then began investigating the Dinah McNicol disappearance and had a break in the case when they learned that Tobin had lived in the home at 50 Irvine Drive in Margate and talked with his former neighbors. David Martin told them about the time that Tobin had dug a large hole in his yard that was supposedly going to be a sandpit for his son, but that had been filled in a couple days later. Police immediately obtained a search warrant to scan the yard with radar, resulting in the November 12th discovery of a body. The first to be found was Vicky Hamilton, identified initially by her clothing. The coroner's report showed that she had been brutally assaulted and likely strangled before she was dismembered. Dental records and her mother's rings confirmed her identity. Tobin's DNA was found on the bag that contained her torso, but even more horrifying is that his son's DNA was also found, indicating at the very least that he had been present when the crime occurred. Dinah's remains were found shortly after, wrapped up in 16 plastic garbage bags and still tied up. The trials began on March 23, 2007. The first crime that Tobin was tried for was the Kluk homicide. When the judge sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum of 21 years before parole, he described Tobin as an evil man. Why would the judge not just give him what they call in Britain a full life tariff based on his history? I have no idea. On December 2, 2008, he was sentenced for the Hamilton homicide to life with a minimum of 30 years, Again, the number of crimes and his past arrests should have eliminated any chance at parole. On the 16th of December 2009, Tobin was sentenced for the homicide of Dinah McNicol. For this crime, he would finally receive the full life tariff that he deserved. But investigators still had many unanswered questions, and nearly 36 pieces of jewelry found at the creature's home were shown to the public in the hopes of identifying other victims. Peter Tobin had a rough time in prison due to both his health and, understandably, from the other inmates who knew why he was there. In 2012, he would be sent to the infirmary of the Edinburgh prison with chest pains and a suspected heart attack. 3 years later, he would be slashed by his cellmate, 31-year-old Sean Moynihan, with a razor blade, resulting in a nearly 8-inch gash across his face. After a stroke in 2016 and a cancer diagnosis in 2019, Tobin was once again moved to the hospital on March 30, 2022. His health continued to deteriorate until he passed away on the 8th of October of that year at the age of 76. Just under a week later, when no family came to claim his ashes, they were scattered at sea, though they should have just flushed them down the toilet.